Welcome to the Delingpod with me, James Delingpole. I know I always say I'm excited about this week's special guest, but I really am. Back for a second time is Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, so much has happened since we last spoke, and I was thinking, actually, before we go on, guess what I've just been doing?
What? I dread to think.
Well, I think it's the thing that you and I both like most in the world, isn't it? That keeps us sane.
Oh, riding!
Yeah.
Yay! Horses. It has to be. Yeah.
I've been on my horse, and the world is looking slightly less shit than it did before I got on the horse.
Yeah, nothing like. I've just put the dogs to bed, so that sounds like babies, but they are literally asleep on the floor. So I'm hoping they're not going to wake up in the middle.
You're in Syria, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it Aleppo?
No, I'm in Damascus.
Damascus. I was, for some weird reason, maybe it was because I knew this podcast was coming, I was thinking, I really, really wish I'd been to Syria, because I'll bet there's just some amazingly good stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, everyone always says to me they're very sad that I never came to Syria before the war, never before 2011. So I never really saw it when it was as progressive and prosperous and really, really. I mean, it is still beautiful, but it's kind of it's sad at the moment because they've transitioned from the military war, which to some extent it sounds odd, but it has a kind of energy to it. Now they're in that kind of economic stagnation period post-war, when the US coalition is basically doubling down on the economic and siege tactics, which are sort of draining the country of its lifeblood very slowly, and so it's difficult to be here in these circumstances.
Just broadly, what are they trying to achieve? Is their mission still to depose Assad? Is that their main aim of all the sanctions and so on?
Yeah, I mean, now they perceive that they can use the sanctions, as I said, in a post-war environment, which of course is a very testing environment where people need to be able to rebuild and to resettle into areas from which they were driven out by the various terrorist groups.
Yeah.
Of course, America predominantly is occupying the northeast, so it's occupying the oil-rich region, both directly and through its various proxies, which include ISIS and include the Kurdish Contras, the Kurdish separatist groups that want to make this particular region in the northeast an autonomous region, which of course is supported by Israel, US, UK, and EU, because this is the amputation of parts of Syria and the sort of reduction of Syria down to a very insular central state, which is effectively occupied on almost all its borders. And, the only border that isn't really occupied is part of the Jordan border and the border with Lebanon. But of course, Lebanon has also been put into economic freefall and is teetering on the edge of being a failed state. So, things are incredibly difficult. I mean, the fact that the US coalition is occupying the oil fields means that we don't have electricity, we don't have fuel. We're rationed now to 20 litres per month of fuel. And 20 litres now costs around 100,000 Syrian pounds, whereas before we were less than 10,000. Just to give you an indication of inflation. Yeah. The price of food is going through the roof. Because again, in the northeast, that's the sort of agricultural breadbasket. In the areas that are now under the protection of the Syrian government, which is the majority of Syria, is being deprived of resources, oil, water, agricultural. And so, this is, as I said, this is a sort of it's a slow, silent death because no one's really paying any attention to it, because sanctions are far less sort of dramatic than war. You know, it's like everyone now is focused on Ukraine because Ukraine is at that hot point of the war. It's when it's kind of sexy to talk about it. Syria, very much like Yemen now, has just slipped off the media radar because it's not important. But that doesn't mean that the West isn't still pursuing its, let's say, plan B of partitioning Syria. And I mentioned this to you, that Victoria Nuland, who of course was also instrumental in the 2014 coup orchestrated by the US and the UK and by Israel in Ukraine, is now effectively engineering the annexation of the Northeast through lifting sanctions in the Northeast because they consider it to be under the control of their Kurdish separatist proxies. But also they are managing the movement of ISIS in this area and across the border into Iraq. You know, the US has never actually been against ISIS. It's always weaponized it, used it, equipped it, armed it, and is now recruiting for ISIS, both in Syria and in Iraq.
That is an extraordinary claim, which I'm going to ask you to give me evidence of in a moment. Sure. But before we go there, and I also want to talk to you about Ukraine, obviously. But what is the strategic aim of the US, or rather the, what would you call them, the deep state? I mean, the people who are really in charge of US or coalition, if you like, foreign policy. What is, they're trying to shrink Syria in order to do what?
Well, in order to ensure that Syria's borders are never able to be secure. Because one of the main reasons, of course, that this war was able to start in the first place is because weapons and arms were coming in through the Turkish border. So terrorists from Libya were being percolated into Turkey, where they were being re-equipped and trained, etc., by NATO member states before being allowed to infiltrate Syria through the Turkish borders. The same in Jordan, weapons and terrorists were coming across the border there. Even from Lebanon to some degree. I mean, the mountains of Kalamoun, which sort of split the border between Syria and Lebanon, there, al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, although it's gone through a few rebrands, were effectively training prior to both leading attacks against, for example, Christian communities in Lebanon, but also against Christian communities, particularly that border the Kalamoun Mountains here in Syria. So, you know, I think the plan is to ensure that Syria can never regain its border security. Along the northern border, for example, you have Turkey now manufacturing a buffer zone. I mean, it's even erecting a security wall very similar to the ones that you see in Palestine and the occupied territories. It is building settlements in the northwest. It's providing electricity to those settlements. So effectively, it is encroaching onto Syrian territory. And in the northeast, under Victoria Nuland's plan, the autonomous region, as they like to call it, but it's only autonomous because, of course, they've ethnically cleansed Arabs, Assyrians, Armenians from this area to enable the majority rule of the Kurdish separatists that are, despite media to the opposite, or media claims to the opposite, are related to PKK, that was formerly designated a terrorist organization by the US. Now, of course, it's a US proxy, it's a US weapon against its target nation. So, you know, those terrorist charges have kind of been dropped, and the entire organization has been rebranded. So in the northeast, for example, you'll have Kurdish settlements stealing oil, stealing agricultural produce and trading it outside Syria and reducing the amount that can come into Damascus and then get fed out to the population. But in the northern border area, you have the Turkish militia, which will also benefit from this sort of sanction-free licensing, So in other words, Al-Qaeda, because the Turkish proxies are effectively Al-Qaeda and affiliates, will be able to start building settlements in this buffer zone. So, what does this mean? This means that this entire border zone will remain insecure for Syrians. Right. And there won't be a safe exit. There's only one exit area in the northeast, Al-Bukamal, and that's where Israel and the US consistently bomb, because that's where Syria does have a very small window of trade with Iraq.
Right. That sounds very complicated. I just want to take a step back for a moment, because as you know, yeah, Vanessa, I used to have a very different understanding of geopolitics.
You used to?
And yes. I mean, I imagine, I don't know whether you even knew of me, but I imagine you wouldn't have liked a lot of my, you probably have thought kindly that I was naive or ill-informed, maybe at best. But
well, I think if you remember when you first contacted me over COVID, I did say to you, rather primly, I'm not sure our views are going to be cohesive on Israel and on the Middle East. But, yeah.
I'm a peace and love kind of guy, except I have to say now, increasingly, Vanessa, my tolerance for the normie view of the world is becoming increasingly strained, because I just think, how could you be so effing stupid? I mean, really. I think, obviously I would say this because I'm a recent convert, but I would say that it was excusable to have the normie vision of the world 2.5 years ago, but so much has happened. The globalist elites, well, the predator class, I call them, their master plan to enslave us all is now so advanced that you'd need to be absolutely purblind, would you not, to see what's going on. Nevertheless, that is the case for most of the world still. But so just taking a step back, 2.5 years ago, I wasn't totally credulous. I did slightly question it, but the narrative seemed something like this, and there were BBC documentaries to support this. President Assad, may have been an innocuous ophthalmologist once, but has become an evil dictator. He has to be thrown out, and so do the evil Russians, and in the north. There's this one of the great white hopes are the Kurds, who are heroically battling ISIS, and they're establishing this new state. If only we can help them build it. Rojava, is that?
Rojava.
And what else? That Syria is a basket case, and the West must intervene. And do you remember going back? Samantha Cameron sort of weeping when Parliament voted against the chance to bomb the fuck out of I don't know where it was, Damascus or wherever.
Yeah,
this is what passes for news.
Yeah, absolutely. That was after the Eastern Ghouta alleged chemical attack. I mean, all the chemical attacks have been, very well debunked by various experts and analysts. I mean, I think that one. Even Carla Del Ponte sort of ruled out that it was the Syrian government or the Syrian army that could have carried out the attack because of the trajectory of the missiles, etc., etc. And of course, the coincidence that the UN inspectors arrived to investigate an alleged terrorist chemical weapon attack against the Syrian Arab army and civilians 6 months prior, and the day that they arrived, suddenly, oops. The Syrian government just happens to carry out a chemical weapon attack while they're there. I mean,
they're obviously very stupid. But, so just before we go, I'm dying to hear about how the US and is in bed with ISIS and funding them and stuff, and the same that applies to Al Qaeda. I'm sure you've got evidence to support this extraordinary claim. But before, just give me what. You mentioned Victoria Nuland, who's Assistant Secretary of State in the US. So she's kind of representative of US,
acting Assistant Secretary of State, whatever that means.
She definitely she definitely has the whip hand right now. And obviously, she's representing the most powerful faction in America in terms of foreign policy, regardless of whether she represents the interests of the American people or anyone else. She is de facto in charge of American foreign policy. So what is there? What are they trying to do in the Middle East? What's the game plan? I mean, not just Syria, but elsewhere. What's going on?
Well, I mean, of course, the main target in the Middle East is both Russia and Iran, and eventually China, because, of course, the strategic importance of Syria for China, for example, is that it's the main hub for the Belt and Road Initiative, the old Silk Road. And that was one of the reasons, of course, that Syria was targeted. One, it didn't accept the Qatari pipeline, which was backed by the United States, which was proposed in 2000. And Bashar al-Assad effectively turned it down because he said he preferred to go with his longtime ally, Russia, and Iran. And of course, that was total anathema to the US unipolarity and supremacy, particularly in the region, and protecting the security of Israel, which is effectively a military outpost for the US in the Middle East. The alliance between Syria and Russia, and formerly the Soviet Union, has been one of the main reasons for around 75 years of CIA and MI6 destabilization projects in Syria. This war it's the first of many, going back to when Syria gained its independence from France in 1946, after Sykes-Picot, after the Middle East was carved up between Britain and France. France had the mandate in Syria. In 46, Syria gained its independence. It was a painful end to its mandate. I mean, France fought back and tried to prevent it, obviously. And then from then on in, basically, whenever there was what was perceived then as a pro-communist government in Syria, it was removed. So for a period of time, there were endless coups and counter-coups in Syria until President Hafez al-Assad came to power, and even then it didn't stop. Even then the Muslim Brotherhood was weaponized on at least 2 occasions against Hafez al-Assad's government, the most notable being the late 70s, early 80s, and of course Western media described it as the massacre in Hama, a city to the north of Damascus. In reality, this was Hafez al-Assad's government putting down a very similar uprising to the one, I put uprising in inverted commas, to the one that we saw in 2011, which was, again, the weaponization of the Muslim Brotherhood factions that were rebranded as the Free Syrian Army. There are multiple WikiLeaks documents, WikiLeaks emails, CIA redacted documents attesting to the fact that the US for a long time had this agenda to impose what they described as a sort of moderate Sunni Islam government, which they believed would be more favorable towards the US, towards trading with the US, because the Sunni Islam community is perceived to be the wealthy capitalist business class here in Syria. So they believed that by using the Muslim Brotherhood to achieve this aim, they could put in someone that would effectively comply with the US regionally. Right. And of course, even leading up to, I think we discussed this, even leading up to 2011, I mean, back in 2003, Blair and Bush were talking about potentially destabilizing Syria, but that they would try to foster a different relationship with Bashar al-Assad. And indeed, that's what they did for a period of time. I mean, pre-2009, Tony Blair was going to give him a knighthood. There were various academic tomes written about this, new lion of Damascus, extolling his progressive and reformist policies, etc. And then suddenly in 2009, he kind of fell off the cliff, and suddenly, as you said, was converted into Hitler overnight.
Yeah. Okay, so just briefly to recap, the strategic importance of Syria is to do with for the Chinese, the Belt and Road Initiative, and China is now Russia's allies, but also it's part of the West's proxy war against Russia, so that Assad is being punished for backing, in the West's view, the wrong side. Therefore, he's going to be made very uncomfortable forevermore.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting, if you go back to a Wesley Clark interview in 2014, now Wesley Clark is the former general who told everyone, the 7 countries, that the US was going to take out in a period of time, and that included Syria and Yemen, I can't remember all of them, Iraq, Libya, etc. And in 2014, he talked about the American policy being very much that they wanted to prevent the rise of a competitive superpower, and that this window of opportunity to prevent this happening, so to maintain their unipolarity, was narrowing. And of course, then what happened in 2015? So 1 year, and the timing is sort of very important here. So 1 year after the coup in Ukraine, Russia made the decision to come into Syria. In my opinion, those two things are connected, because at that point, Russia saw what was going to happen. I mean, you know, what has happened in Ukraine has been also prophesied for decades. I mean, back to Brzezinski and the Grand Chess Game, you know, talking about the balkanization of Russia, the surrounding of Russia, in other words, the kind of declawing of Russia as a competitor to the US. And so I think Russia saw what was going on and thought, okay, we should expand our military base in Syria, because they already had a naval base, military base on the Mediterranean coast for the last, well, now 60 years. And of course, there they have expanded that, and they've brought in various aircraft. I mean, I'm not an expert in military at all, but they've brought in planes that are capable of launching tactical nukes, etc., etc. They brought in their fleet when, you know, it seemed that something was going to kick off in Ukraine. They brought a large number of their aircraft carriers into Syria. So for Russia, it's very, very important to have this military base here in the Middle East, in Syria in particular. But I think, you know, also for Russia and for China, what was important was, of course, the West had weaponized extremist Islam against Russia in Chechnya, right? And the Chechens, these extremist Chechens, are fighting in Syria. The same situation for China, the Uyghurs, or the extremist factions among the Uyghurs that reside in Xinjiang province, which of course is central to the Belt and Road Initiative, are also fighting inside Syria. There's about 25,000 of them even now in Idlib. So for both Russia and China, it was an exercise in containing their own, if you like, their own indigenous terrorist elements inside Syria and defeating them here before they could be released back to their own countries and continue the destabilization campaign there.
Oh, right. I see. That's interesting. So now ISIS, yeah. I've read that ISIS was essentially a creation of the second, or the aftermath of the Second Gulf War, and the American administration put together all the kind of most radical activists in the same camps, and they coalesced and they created this situation, which was, you know, I mean, well, ISIS became the world's biggest headache to a time, didn't they? And we saw atrocity porn every day, and the beheadings and stuff. But you're saying that ISIS actually have always been a tool of American foreign policy?
Well, in Syria, for sure. I mean, the thing is that I tend to see all of these sort of terrorist elements as one cartel or one mafia cartel, let's say. They're marketed or rebranded by the US and the UK when it suits them. So, for example, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, when they came back into Yemen, they became AQAP, Al Qaeda Arab Peninsula. In Syria, Al Qaeda became Nusra Front. Now it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and various other sort of offshoots of that. ISIS, at one point, they were going to call it, I don't know if you remember, under the Obama administration, they toyed with the idea of calling it Khorasan. This was actually floated for about 2 weeks, and then nobody really sort of picked it up, so they went back to ISIS. But yeah, I mean, if you look at from the beginning under Obama's train and equip program, which was allegedly for the so-called moderates inside Syria, how all the arms that were sent to train and equip the moderates in Syria ended up in the hands of ISIS. The fact that ISIS could move from areas of Iraq across 500 kilometers of desert in Syria and not be picked up by American surveillance systems. The fact that in 2016, two things in 2016, John Kerry, in a closed session in the UN in September 2016, admitted that the US had allowed ISIS to flourish because they believed that it would be a very good weapon against the Syrian government. And in the same year, when the Syrian Arab Army had surrounded Deir ez-Zor, so to the east of the Euphrates, and at that time Deir ez-Zor was occupied by ISIS, and there were hundreds of thousands of civilians being held prisoner and kept as human shields. I mean, it sounds very familiar to what's happening in Ukraine, and we can come on to that. At a point where the Syrian Arab Army had taken position on one of the strategic mountains overlooking Deir ez-Zor, the Americans, the British, the Danish, and the Australians bombed the Syrian Arab Army positions for more than an hour, killing more than 100 Syrian Arab Army soldiers, and according to witness testimony, strafing them with machine guns when they tried to escape the bombing, allowed ISIS to advance to that strategic point. This was one of the, I mean, for me, just one of the worst. I was here when it happened. And it was really one of the worst atrocities of this war, carried out directly by the UK, the US, the Danish, and the Australians as part of the US coalition. So that was clear evidence of the US providing air cover for ISIS. And of course, that's effectively what they've done. When in 2018, sorry, I lose track of dates, more than 200 civilians were killed in the south in an area called Sweda. I actually visited it only a few days after the killings. ISIS attacked 3 villages to the east of the town itself. At 4 a.m. they attacked. They massacred more than 200 civilians, injured 300 more. Now, they had come from an area in the desert that is completely controlled by the United States. So they had come under the surveillance of the United States at that point, armed by the United States, as we later heard from members of ISIS that had been captured from the group that had carried out the massacre.
Literally, the US handed them the weapons. There wasn't even any kind of question of stealing.
Absolutely. I mean, in the northeast, on an almost daily basis, the US is ferrying ISIS fighters from one area of the northeast to another area of the northeast, where they can carry out, Rand paper calls it the swarming new warfare, which is small bands of guerrilla warfare. Guerrillas are embedded, and from there they carry out attacks against Syrian army convoys, against oil convoys, Syrian army positions. So even now from Homs and to the east into the Badia, into the Syrian desert, there are still pockets of ISIS, and those are being put there. We have video evidence. I mean, it's a known fact here in Syria that America is using ISIS on a daily basis. And not only that, it ferries them from Syria into Iraq, where they are retrained and re-equipped, and then they're brought back into Syria. And even in Iraq, for example, when the government starts to get a bit antsy and starts telling the US to leave, ISIS strangely start attacking the electrical power stations in Iraq. So it's obvious, because ISIS is acting in lockstep with US foreign policy in the region, right? And I mean, the only time that ISIS was defeated was when Russia came in 2015. And all of a sudden, whereas ISIS under America had been flourishing and had been moving deeper and deeper into Syrian territory, when Russia came in September 2015, within a few months, you started to see ISIS being driven out of all the areas they'd taken when the US was allegedly fighting.
Wasn't there was an incident, wasn't there? I remember, where the Americans took out, was it the Wagner Group? They took out a large number of Russian, I don't know whether they were actually officially soldiers, whether they were perhaps mercenaries or contract. You don't remember that? Doesn't matter. No. Here's a question I wanted to ask you, and this is a question I wouldn't have even considered a thing 2.5 years ago. But how much of what is happening in the Middle East is actually a product of so-called Islamic fundamentalism? That there are these kind of extreme Islamists who just, they're a kind of death cult and they want to restore the caliphate. And how much of it is basically young men with too much testosterone being exploited by a sort of gangster cartel to fight their wars for them?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there has been a program of radicalization, particularly in Europe and in the UK. There are Saudi Arabia in particular sheikhs who have come in for this purpose, to radicalize many of the young Muslims. And so therefore, yes, they feel driven to go and do jihad, particularly in Syria. Again, the Muslim Brotherhood also has a very strong presence in the UK and in the EU, but in the UK in particular. And of course, to a large degree, it's a UK or a British construct that was established in Egypt in the late 30s as a counterpoint to Gamal Abdel Nasser, who, of course, Nasser was pushing for a United Arab Republic. He was pushing for pan-Arabism, which again was anathema. Like, how dare the Arabs have control of their resources?
Quite.
So this is the point at which the Muslim Brotherhood emerged and was weaponized against these dreadful people that wanted to privatize their own resources. I mean, heaven forbid.
Right.
Sorry, or nationalize, I should say, rather than privatize. And so I mean, for me, the hand of the intelligence agencies is behind all of it. So while there may be young people that are easily radicalized or even easily ideologized, if that's such a word. For example, the number of fighters that went to join the Kurdish Contras, because they saw this, as you described it, this sort of chance at a women's rights, democracy, even sort of an anarchist dream in Rojava, and because it was a mixture. It was sold both as a democracy and as a sort of anarchist's haven in the northeast of Syria. And in fact, I mean, the interesting thing is that many of those young mercenaries, because that's effectively what they are, they maybe went and fought for an ideology, but I don't quite, I've been looking into many of the mercenaries who fought in the northeast and are now establishing the same kind of scenario in Ukraine. So I have a little less sympathy for that kind of ideology, let's say, because at the end of the day, you know, they don't. The thing is that when you have, for example, a British mercenary that decides to go and fight in Syria on behalf of the Kurds, they are sold a line. Right, they are sold a line effectively by the British intelligence agencies. They have no understanding of the region, of the culture, of what fighting for these groups that are backed by the United States coalition, the effect that is going to have on the Syrian people, right? And in the same way, these same mercenaries have gone to Ukraine. And one of them, Aidan Aslin, who's a British guy who was fighting in the northeast, has now been arrested in Donetsk, and he will face trial because he was fighting alongside the Ukrainian ultranationalists and Nazi brigades that have been massacring the people of Donetsk and Lugansk for the last 8 years. So he will be put on trial. You know, but in reality, these guys should be put on trial in Syria also for what they enabled. They sustained the war here in Syria for whatever reasons they came. But, you know, going back to the radicalization, these radicalization programs are well organized, and they're organized essentially by intelligence agencies, both in the UK and the EU and in the United States, for sure.
That was the question I was really asking. Now, I've got to tell you, Vanessa, one of the annoyances where I go riding, we go around these fields and we do a bit of cantering and stuff. It's annoying at the moment. The ground's too hard. I don't know how you cope in Syria, by the way. I mean, the ground must be always too hard for riding.
Well, no, because I'm quite lucky. The horse I ride is a rescue racehorse. And so I have the entire racetrack, so 3 kilometers of sand track to ride on every single day.
Oh, thanks. Do you do jumps?
No, there aren't any jumps there. I keep asking them to sort of cobble something together, but they haven't so far. So I keep trying to sell them on the whole idea of steeplechasing, but it's kind of...
That'd be so good, wouldn't it?
It's a little bit beyond them.
You know, the racing industry in the UK, I mean, I'm sure the stories like this are being played out in every sector across the world. The racing industry is really suffering. I heard for somebody, I think it was Chester races, which has got like half the number of people who used to go, and apparently the reason for that is people got out of the habit after 2 years of sort of lockdown and stuff, and secondly because people are really starting to feel the pinch, and they've decided that going to the races is a luxury and that they better save the money elsewhere. And I think about what's happening in the world now. It is a war, would you agree with me, on humanity? Everything that makes our lives worthwhile is being slowly crushed and constrained by the shadowy forces that I call the predator class.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with regards to, I mean, here racing it's a little bit different because it's Syrian Arab horse racing, so they're all pure Syrian Arab. He's a Syrian Arabian stallion from one of the oldest strains in the Middle East, or in Syria in particular. It's very much a sort of a community. You know, the Bedouins used to have the horses in the desert and then bring them into the racetracks, or the rather rudimentary racetracks. Now they are actually quite posh for Syria. And as I say, I'm very fortunate. I have a 3 kilometer racetrack to ride on. So but yeah, I agree.
Is it like riding a thoroughbred? Sorry? Like sort of floating on air?
No, they're a lot squarer and a lot tougher than thoroughbreds, and not as kind of flighty.
Right.
I mean, the stallions in particular are actually very brave. I mean, they're war horses. They're little war horses, really, right, more than race horses. Now they are breeding the finer horses into them, so you will get Arabian cross French or Egyptian, something like that. So but I don't like them as much as the traditional Syrian Arabians, which are really quite chunky, you know, and very warhorsey. You've got that wonderful neck in front of you, you know, you feel completely safe on them.
I
However,
fancy I
nutty
fancy
they
a
are.
go. That was anyway the bit of the story I didn't
Anytime.
get round to was before we get to the jumping field. There is this. It's like a stable yard or something, and fluttering outside is the Union Jack, and below it, guess what? This blue and yellow
No, not the
flag.
Ukrainian.
And I'm
No.
thinking, okay, we're talking rural Northamptonshire. How much does the guy who runs this stable yard or whatever it is, how much does he know about the geopolitics of Ukraine? Had he even heard of Ukraine before it suddenly became the topic du jour? And this, of course, I tell you, if you came to England, you would find, well, actually, you can see it on the internet, people with blue and yellow flags in their bios, and people, I mean, like my good friend Toby Young, just essentially rehearsing MI6 CIA talking points about, and repeating as fact information which has clearly come from Kyiv, their propaganda department. You know, it bears no relation to reality. And you must find it as frustrating. Well, you've been on top of this longer than I have, so you must find this very, very frustrating. So what's your take on what's happening in Ukraine right now?
Well, I mean, I find it beyond frustrating. I find it actually really disgusting how people are behaving. I mean, we are effectively empowering Nazis, supporting and promoting Nazis. And of course, I'm not saying all the Ukrainian people are Nazis, but what I'm saying is it's the same comparison in Syria. People will say to you, yeah, but in Idlib, they're not all Al Qaeda. But the fact is, it's Al Qaeda that have control because they are weaponized by NATO member states, they are equipped by NATO member states, they are protected by NATO member states, and they're given free rein to do what they want. And that includes carrying out reprisals against civilians that won't come into line with them, right? So they are the dominant force. It doesn't matter what the numbers are, they're the dominant force.
Yes.
Because they are being empowered to be so by the West.
Yeah.
And you know, this is an important delineation to make. And when you are displaying your Slava Ukrainian flags, right, you are enabling the war. That's the bottom line. Because the West doesn't give a shit about the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people are dying. All it means for the West and for the BBC and Channel 4 and The Guardian and Simon Tisdale of The Guardian, who's one of the most disgusting journalists on this planet, right? Who led the kind of intervention narratives against Syria and is now doing the same against Putin. You know, Putin. Putin has now taken on the mantle of Hitler from Assad. Assad has been not entirely forgotten. They will keep sort of pushing away and prodding away with all their little intelligence security apparatus tactics, for sure, as they are globally. Yeah. But Putin has taken center stage as the number one demon. And the fact that people are buying this, the fact that people are pushing what they think, I mean, you know, in their hearts, they probably feel they are supporting the underdog against this terrible invader. But the problem is the media, James. You know, the media is 100% responsible for the death of those Ukrainian people.
Yes.
Of course, you know, the predator class, as you call them, or the parasite class, as I call them, are ultimately responsible. But it's the media that is the glue that holds this all together.
Yes.
And that brainwashes and gaslights people into taking a side, right? The same as they did in COVID, the same as they did in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Venezuela.
Hang on, there's somebody at the door. I just got to give me 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I could have left it, but then I thought it was haunting me, and it was like thinking, well, it's distracting me from Vanessa's interest.
Distracting you.
Yeah, I don't like being distracted by worries, which happens to me all the time. Yeah, no, I agree, and I don't know whether you heard fascinating podcast I did the other day with Jacques
Yeah.
Bull, Swiss intelligence
Yeah.
colonel, who said, and I thought this was a useful bit of information, that 102,000 of the Ukrainian military are basically far right paramilitary. Yeah, I mean that's effectively half the Ukrainians' military are far right Nazis, and it's funny. You talk to a normie about this. I mean, I use the term normie loosely to anyone who's well, certainly it applies to anyone who's got a Ukraine flag flying in their profile, and they seem to have these stock answers which they've been given by the BBC or whatever their trusted news sources are. And in this case, the stock answer is yes, but you have to understand well, this is the point you made, that they're a minority. That yes, there are Nazis, but there are really not many of them. Like, and you're thinking, why not many? How many are you thinking? Are you thinking maybe there's 5 or 6? How many is not many Nazis? Because by my reckoning, there are a fuck ton of Nazis that we are supporting. And another thing, so let me continue my rant, and then I'll give the floor back to you. But we live in a culture where you hear politicians parading their virtue non-stop about gender, about race, about mental health issues, about all these things that really matter. And you're thinking, hang on a second, you're doing this stuff while at the same time bankrolling and giving weapons to terrorists in the Middle East who are killing the husbands, raping the women, enslaving their children, getting the youngest children to sell to pedophiles in slave markets. And you're not doing anything to stop this. And you're in Ukraine, you're bankrolling and providing military materiel and intelligence to people who are shelling civilians, murdering civilians in cold blood, treating captured Russian soldiers, abusing them horribly, either by castrating them or kneecapping them and leaving them to bleed out. And yet you're going on TV with your smiley face saying how much you care about the world. What is going on, Vanessa? I mean, isn't it time to get angry about this shit?
Oh God, I mean, I don't know about you, but I wake up I call it a perma rage. I mean, I honestly I mean, it's just endless. We are ruled by sociopaths, if I'm being kind, and by psychopaths if I want to take it to the next level. But
they are psychopaths.
No, I wouldn't at all. I mean, there are some MPs that one has to assume are a little bit kind of dim and a little bit misguided and not very well informed, and rely on the BBC for their information and their understanding of the situation, right? But I've said this all along. When you look at what the terrorists, the atrocities that they committed here in Syria, and in all honesty, I don't very often talk about the details because they are so horrendous and so satanic that it is genuinely shocking for people. But what we have to remember is that those terrorists and their actions are a reflection of the people in power in our own countries. And the same thing can be said for the Nazis in Ukraine. And what people also don't understand, and this is exactly what happened in Syria, it's only when areas are liberated that the full extent of the crimes of these groups, these fanatical groups, supremacist groups, whether they are Nazi, whether they are Islamist, it doesn't matter. I'm sorry, the dogs have woken up. They are committing atrocities that are funded by our government. And when areas are liberated by the Russians, we are going to find out the full extent of the crimes that those Nazi brigades were committing for years since 2014. And that includes, for example, Dilyana Gaitanjeva, the Bulgarian journalist, told me when I interviewed her about the biolabs, she told me that Bulgarian nationals inside Ukraine have for years been targeted by these battalions because they won't sort of go and join up to bomb and massacre the people in Donetsk and Luhansk. So they have been arrested, detained, tortured, executed, even pregnant women, okay? So all of these stories, well, one, the media in the West will try and cover them up. As you said, even the torture of Russian POWs, exactly the same thing happened in Syria and was rarely spoken about in Western media. I noticed the other day that even Le Monde in France has finally put out a report about the atrocities being committed by, they call them the Ukrainian forces. I mean, this sort of blanket disappearing of the Nazi element in this, and the flipping, the inversion of reality, the pointing out that Putin is the real fascist and these guys are just nationalists fighting to defend their homeland. Whereas 2 years ago, all of them were reporting on the Nazi threat in the Ukraine. I mean, this is the thing. I don't understand how people's memories are so short, right? It's like the governments that lied to you about COVID, the governments that lied to you about Syria, about Libya, about Iraq, about pretty much everything, right? Suddenly in Ukraine, they're telling the truth.
Yeah. I remember not so, I'm old enough to remember, Vanessa, old enough to remember, maybe you are too, a time when the American, I don't believe in left and right, so I don't know what, but the sort of radical groups like Antifa, who I'm sure are funded by the deep state, by the same people, when they said that it was legitimate to punch a Nazi. And yet now these same people are hugging Nazis, arming them, and sending them, go and do your stuff, Nazi. But
now it's legitimate to punch a Russian.
Yes, it's extraordinary. I mean, I remember even at the time of the punch a Nazi thing, thinking how there was a sort of cultural coarsening that has taken place in the last 20 years, where I'm sure that 20 years ago, had you advocated for violence of any kind, you would have been anathematized. You would not have. You certainly wouldn't have been. There was a case recently when one of the talk radio people was essentially saying that it was legitimate for the Ukrainian armed forces to castrate and torture Russian prisoners because it was their fault for invading a sovereign territory in the first place. I'm not sure that in my lifetime I can remember a period where that would have been a legitimate comment for a radio host to make. He'd have been criticized. He'd probably lost his job. And now,
exactly. It's extraordinary. And now, you even have the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, advocating mercenaries to go and fight in Ukraine. They tried desperately to sort of backpedal on that announcement from her. But this is extraordinary because even from a legal perspective, how does the British government get itself out of this? There are now a number of British mercenaries that have been arrested and they will be tried for war crimes. They don't come under the Geneva Convention, but they are British citizens. It's extraordinary.
Isn't it even more complicated? It gets even more complicated, doesn't it? Because there is clear evidence. We know that in Azovstal, for example, that there are definitely NATO officers trapped underground. So you've got the Canadian colonel, I think he is, or maybe he's even higher
Trevor Kadya.
Say again?
Trevor Kadya. I don't think that has been fully confirmed, but it is believed that he was arrested trying to escape.
But it's not just him, is it? We've got
no.
French military, we've got, I mean, if I, because I look at the Intel Slava, where you get I think probably, although it's Russian propaganda, at the same time I think Russian propaganda is probably more accurate of what's going on than anything you find in the BBC or the Daily Mail or the Telegraph.
Sorry.
Oh, that's good. No, we like. Oh, lovely. We like a bit of doggage in there.
The problem is it's feed time, so it's like they're getting extremely irritable.
Okay.
Well, get down.
You just have to learn discipline your dogs, like I'm incapable of. And I the other day, I think something like 5 American, they must have been special forces, got taken out by. So you've got. Look, Vanessa, this is how much I've changed. When I was a boy, I had books about the SAS. I knew everything there was to know about the SAS. They were my heroes. I still, I know people who are in the SAS. I know their families, and I like them and I respect them for their courage and stuff. It really upsets me to see the cream of our military, decent people who just want to serve their country, actually not serving people like me, the taxpayer, but are serving this shadowy class, which has gone into Ukraine not for moral reasons, but simply as a kind of to safeguard their money laundering operation, to help bring forward the global famine that we're experiencing now by attacking the world's wheat bread basket, and yet I know that they've been out there, probably in the Ukraine for at least a year, is what I hear from some of my sources.
I think.
Training. Okay. So they're like the advisors that were in Vietnam before the escalation. What does one say about that?
It's exactly the same. I mean, exactly the same role in Syria. In fact, there was a point, I can't remember exactly which year, maybe 2017, that there were allegedly SAS operatives who downed arms in southern Syria and said, okay, look, we've had enough, and left. But effectively, they were doing the same thing. They were training the so-called moderate terrorists, the moderate extremists inside Syria in the same way. I mean, Lviv, for example, and in reality, I mean, it's quite interesting. Recently, there has been a spate of information coming out about British mercenaries that were embedded in Syria, as I said, predominantly in the northeast. There's one guy, Mesa Gifford, which is a pseudonym, who's trying to set up the White Helmets. Of course, the White Helmets were an intelligence construct embedded with the armed groups and terrorist groups inside Syria, providing the corroborating propaganda to British and American foreign policy inside Syria. Now we have this mercenary guy with clear links to sort of FBI, MI6, security services, Parliament, the Carlton Club. I mean, you couldn't make it up. Is now going to Ukraine to establish a Ukrainian White Helmets under the name of the Nightingale Squadron. Now, the Nachtigall Squadron was effectively a Nazi battalion. So, I mean, this is, and another guy, Daniel Burke, another mercenary from Syria who's gone to Ukraine, is setting up the Dark Angels, which conjures up all ideas of Mengele and all the rest that, I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's not even subtle anymore. And the number of NATO member states that have been in Lviv training the Azov and Aidar battalions, there's reams of document evidence about that on the web. It's very easy to find. But the kind of the elephant in the room, and I know for you this is quite a big elephant, is the Israeli involvement in this. And I know how everyone sort of says, well, Zelensky's a Jew, how on earth can he be collaborating with the Nazi elements inside Ukraine? But if you look at who's funding both, it's Igor Kolomoisky, who has three-way citizenship. He's an Israeli citizen, Ukrainian and American, I think. Kolomoisky is also involved in the Hunter Biden scandal in the Burisma holdings. John Kerry's son-in-law is also on the board of Burisma Holdings. From 2014 onwards, Biden was talking about hijacking the resources in Ukraine, because he perceived that as a way, of course, to cut the Russian, as he perceived it, supremacy in supplying gas and energy resources into Europe. So he thought, right, okay, we'll go into Ukraine, we'll frack, we'll steal the shale gas, potentially the shale oil. I'm not an expert on this, but there is evidence that Exxon and Chevron were given contracts in the Donbass region, because the Donbass, of course, is the kind of resource-rich area in Ukraine for coal and for resources, okay? So, what I'm saying is that there are huge parallels between what's happening in Ukraine, what happened in Syria, what happened in Kosovo, in former Yugoslavia, what happened in every single intervention that the US coalition, and that includes the UK as one of the kind of head honchos in the whole thing, have carried out. And the Israeli connection, or rather the Zionist connection and the collaboration with the Nazi classes, goes way back to even pre-Second World War. In the 1920s, when the president of the Ukrainian Republic, as it was for a short term, Simon Petlura, who carried out some of the most awful pogroms against Jews in the region, killed more than 50,000, according to Zionist media, collaborated with Zeev Jabotinsky to establish a kind of a Jewish paramilitary and a Jewish police force, security force in Ukraine, to be independent to the Ukrainian state unless confronted by Russia. So even back in the 1920s, this collaboration, this ultra-nationalist, secular collaboration between the two ideologies was going on, and it has continued. I mean, Kolomoisky has established the Chabad Lubavitch cult, for example, in Dnipro, where, of course, he had the Privat Bank that was also responsible for much of the money laundering between Ukraine and the United States. But that collaboration between Zionism and ultra-nationalist elements, Nazi elements in Ukraine, has been going on for a very, 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 very long time. And it has as at its root this kind of, and this is where it links into the Great Reset, because let's not forget Schwab's Nazi background. Let's not forget Chrystia Freeland's Nazi background. Okay.
Yeah.
Her grandfather was working for Joseph Goebbels and continued promoting Stepan Bandera, as did Chrystia Freeland. Right. So, when you start to look at that big picture, you suddenly see that Putin's denazification campaign has far wider reaching implications for everything that is going on right now. I'm not putting Putin up on a pedestal. I'm not saying that he's the good guy and he's battling, the kind of the whole of the predator class. No. But what I'm saying is, when you actually start to look at how Western-centric the whole Great Reset agenda is, and how it has many of its roots in this Nazi movement, then when you start to listen to some of Putin's speeches since 2007 until now, and when you realize when he's talking about denazification, is he only talking about Ukraine?
Yeah. I think the jury's out, because you're right. It would be a mistake to assume that.
Yeah,
Putin
I'm not assuming anything.
No, exactly. No,
But I think there is an existentialist war here, because when you look at what Russia represents, and you should appreciate this, it represents conservatism, traditionalism, Orthodox Christianity, right, as compared to the relevant or the debauchery of the West.
Oh, well, it's Luciferian.
Yeah. And the same thing, that was the connection between Russia and Syria. Sorry, I keep not letting you speak. Because Russia came in also to protect the orthodoxy, the Christian orthodoxy in Syria, amongst other things, because the West was effectively eradicating it from the Middle East, although of course they will tell you that they're protecting it and that they're defending Christianity and you know, blah, 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 but they are funding the elements that are destroying it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think this is just an endlessly fascinating rabbit hole to go down. I mean, you know, look, I know there's so much more that we could talk about, because after all, this goes back to at least the 9th century and the Khazarian Empire and all that, and there are links. And I think that Zelensky has said he wants to kind of recreate Khazaria. But I'm gonna you've told me that the Khazarian Jews are not a kind of a particular. I get something else to talk about, like, because I think it is interesting. What I wanted to ask you about before we go is, tell me about the journalist who was presumably murdered. Tell me the story about that and her background.
Oh, sorry, Shireen Abu Akleh, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, in Jenin. Well, you know, I mean, she was clearly assassinated by the IDF. Why can I say that categorically? Because this was a sniper shot. Okay, she was wearing a helmet, she was wearing a bulletproof vest. This was not a kind of a lucky shot from alleged armed Palestinians. And the majority of the witnesses that were there said there were no armed protests going on at all. And the other thing is, of course, when they tried to rescue her, they were also fired on. Now, I can attest to the brutality of these Israeli forces. I mean, for example, as I mentioned to someone else, when you enter Gaza, so when you enter the Gaza Strip, which is an open-air prison, you have to cross a very small amount of tarmac between the Rafah crossing, which is in Egypt, and then to get to the Gaza, the entrance to Gaza. You cannot walk on this tarmac, because if you set foot on this tarmac, you will be shot from the Zionist gun turrets that are all along the wall bordering and the fence bordering Gaza. So, you know, they had been threatening, from what I understand, Shireen, for some time anyway.
Did you know her?
I think what was even... I didn't know her, I'd not met her. Of course, I knew her from her reports, and many of my friends, both here in Palestine and Lebanon, knew her very well and really looked up to her. I mean, she'd been doing her job for a very, very long time. But I think for me, what was really the most awful part of it was the attacks then on the funeral procession. That for me was kind of, I mean, it was just insult to injury.
I didn't know about
the
this,
reporting
this
in Western
obviously hasn't
media,
been reported in the mainstream media.
Very little, and I mean, you know, the reporting even on her death was typical anodyne headlines in Western media. Shireen Abu Akleh dies. You know, not that she was shot, not that she was assassinated. I mean, of course, there has to be an inquiry, but almost without question, everyone was there.
Sure.
And there was another bit of footage that actually filmed the snipers from behind. It was a very, very small clip that was produced just after her death. Someone had been filming it. But the attacks on the funeral procession, I mean, basically, they clubbed the guys who were carrying the coffin. So effectively, at various points, the coffin was almost dropped. Even the car entourage was attacked. Also, Palestinian flags were torn off the roofs of the cars, etc. A girl that was wearing a hijab, underneath was the Palestinian scarf. They forced her to take off her hijab. You know, it has been ramping up for some time. In my opinion, Israel wants war. I mean, a few days ago, they targeted Mesyaf, an area about 150 kilometers from where I am. They killed 5 senior Syrian Arab Army officers in one car. They fired 20 missiles at that car, just that one car. They injured a baby girl and 7 other civilians. You know, and these attacks have been far more regular of late. And although they claim they're targeting Iranian military, well, they don't have a right to do that anyway, because Syria has the right. It's at war. It has the right to call in whatever allies it wants to help it fight this war against external forces. Israel, under international law, has no right to bomb Syria. It certainly has no right to target civilians and to target Syrian military, right, or Syrian air defenses, or Syrian radar, which is what it has been, or Syrian air bases.
Well, presumably their line would be,
opinion,
well, I mean, certainly with Iran, they would say, well, Iran is committed to the destruction of Israel, and Syria is some kind of military threat, and I mean that would be their excuse, wouldn't it?
Well, it would be their excuse, but it's nonsense. I mean, you know, when Israel starts to use passenger jets as decoys to fire its missiles so that Syrian air defense can't respond, because
is that right? I didn't know this. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's done it on a number of occasions. It's done it on, well, that was why, if you remember, I think about a year ago, a Russian military personnel carrier was brought down because the air defense responded to Israeli missiles. The Russian personnel carrier got in the way and it was shot down. But Israel hides behind passenger jets. It's done it on about, I've written about it actually, it's done it on about 3 or 4 occasions inside Syria. And the air defenses have been completely, you know, told to stand down because they can't risk the shooting down of passenger jets carrying more than 200 civilians. You know, can you imagine how that would be played out? And you have to ask yourself, is Israel doing it on purpose in the hope that Syria will bring down a passenger jet and then that will bring the sky down on their heads? But the view here is that Israel is pushing for war. President Assad recently visited Tehran. Again, the view is that they know that Israel is pushing for war and they're preparing for it. So, you know, we've been expecting an escalation for some time now, and the behavior of Israel in the occupied territories, the behavior of Israel in Lebanon, in Syria, is indicating that they want and they need war against Syria, so, or rather against Iran in Syria.
Well, that cheery note is, I think, a really good way of, well, because I've got 3 minutes left, we don't want to do another one. A really good way of ending. Vanessa Beeley, always a joy to talk to you. Tell us where people can find your stuff.
Well, I've recently started a Substack, which seems to be sort of going quite well. And it's a nightmare to navigate that site. And I have Patreon, and I have my blog, which is The Wall Will Fall. Oh, and I have my Telegram channel. So those are probably the best.
Well, I would say,
places.
Dear listeners and viewers, Vanessa is well worth supporting. Really admirable figure. I mean, you're 10 times the journalist I'll ever be, and I salute you. And I envy you.
Come to Syria.
What?
Come to Syria.
Yeah, I may have to. I want to ride that horse. I so do, actually. It only remains to say thank you again to all of those of you who support me on Locals, on Substack, on Subscribestar, and on Patreon. I really appreciate support. I could do with some more supporters. I mean, if you listen to this stuff, I'm not sure that morally you should just be consuming all my stuff for free and really loving it and not giving me any support. That's stealing in my book. But you know, that's up to you and your conscience. Anyway, I love those of you who do help me out. Thank you very much. And thanks to those who buy me a coffee as well. That's really appreciated. Thanks again to Vanessa. I really hope I can come and see you in Syria sometime and ride your horse.
Thanks very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care, James.